Believe it or not, this picture is what launched Big Canoe Historical Society Facebook group. I was searching all over Facebook, all over the internet, trying to find some history on Big Canoe, and I really couldn't find anything. And I thought, man, this is pretty cool. I mean, how often does Lake Disharoon freeze over? And so there is where my quest began about the history of Big Canoe. Each day throughout North Georgia, we drive over roads and we walk paths where proud Cherokees walked and where they hunted and carried on all of the activities of a civilized people. They are not now our neighbors, but what we have in common is that their home is now our home. The Cherokee Nation included all of the land that is now Big Canoe, as well as all of the land of Pickens, Dawson, and other counties north of Chattahoochee River. Big Canoe's Indian Rocks Park is a true archaeological mystery. In 1972, Margaret Russell, an archaeologist from the University of Georgia, was invited by cousins to come to Big Canoe and inspect the rock piles. These rock mounds represent an archaeological unknown. She inspected two of the rock piles and found no relics, bones, or other artifacts. There's no evidence that the rock piles are burial sites. She believes that these rock piles are thousands of years old. Don Wells, president of Mountain Stewarts, has been able to determine that the cairns form a snake pattern. He used a compass to measure the angle that formed from the last cairn to the first. If you follow the line of the angle, it points directly at the island in the middle of Lake Pettit. A Native American Cherokee told Wells that the island was probably a location of a small Indian village that existed in Big Canoe hundreds of years ago. According to Wells, villages such as this often had a high place of special honor where a sacred fire would burn. It's also believed as Indians passed the cairns that they each would lay a rock on the rock piles. Few people can trace their ancestors back 6,000 years, but Floyd Blackwell believed he had done that, and not only did he know who they were, he thought he knew where they lived. In 1941, Floyd and his father discovered what appears to be the remains of an ancient Indian village in North Georgia, now called Big Canoe. His father was a Cherokee Indian and his mother was Creek. Floyd says he and his father found the mountains when they were working for Colonel Sam Tate. Floyd Blackwell had quite a reputation in Big Canoe, and from what I heard, he was quite a ladies' man. He had the reputation of looking like Elvis Presley. What do you think? Indian trail trees, or also known as bent trees, were once very prevalent in this part of Georgia. The Indians native to this area, most often the Cherokee, are assumed to have used them to mark directions or trails to areas that were important to them. They took young saplings, bent them at the right angle, perpendicular to the ground, pointing in the desired direction. Then they tied them in this position. The meanings of the trees are not known. Some of the trees are found marking old Indian trails. Others point to water, shelter, and stream crossings. These living artifacts are a testimony to the skills and the knowledge of the Indian people. The beginning of the Indian trail tree marking system is unknown, but it goes back more than 800 years. In 2003, the Wildflower Bunch located and tagged the bent trees throughout Big Canoe by using a GPS tracking system. They found there's approximately 60 trail trees throughout Big Canoe. The map to the left is located at the lodge. Pioneers, having received land in the Georgia Land Lottery of 1832, began moving into the area now known as Pickens County after the Indians were removed and sent west to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears in 1838. Early settlers, most well known in Big Canoe, are the Pettit family, the Cox family, the Disharoons, the Blackwells, the Sanderlands, the Cowards, and the Weaver family. Some were Irish, some were French, some were English, and some were Scottish. They were all resourceful and self-sufficient people. Throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s, these hardy souls occupied this region. Gradually, most of them became related through marriage. Changes in their lifestyle began as the railroad moved into the area, bringing new industries and jobs. Some of the mountain people began selling off their land and moving down where the jobs could be found. Others continued to pay taxes on their land, while others lost their lands through tax sales. Sam Tate was able to purchase much of the land through tax sales. From early pioneer history through the 70s, the area between Oglethorpe Mountain and Burt Mountain and beyond was home to moonshining operations. During 1956 through 1957, a parade of souped-up cars transporting 35,000 gallons of moonshine made its way from Dawson, Pickens, Lumpkin, and Gilmer County mountain area to the Atlanta market every week. Following World War II, the Atlanta area began to grow rapidly, and with that growth, the demand for cheap whiskey skyrocketed. In fact, Atlanta became the moonshine consumption capital of the U.S. With a good profit to be made, the law of supply and demand really kicked in. As a result, bootlegging was one of the most profitable businesses around from the 1940s through the 1970s. Photo on the left is a young version of Samuel Tate, and then the one on the right is in his older years. Sam Tate never married. He was the founder of the Georgia Marble Company. He also built the pink marble mansion that we see in Tate. Many of his relatives lived there with him. Most of the land where Big Canoe lies was left to his nephew Steve Tate. Wolf Scratch School was built by Sam Tate. He tried to call it Tate Mountain School, but the residents of the hills would not have anything to do with it. It's currently being used as a racket club and the tennis shop, and it is the oldest building that we have in Big Canoe. Most people that see this picture of the Wolf Scratch students think they were poor, and they were. The little girl in the middle with the blonde hair and the white dress, I'm going to introduce her to you later in the presentation. Sam Tate greatly admired the writings of Jacob Riis, the famous American reformer and author. Mr. Riis exposed the conditions of the slums of New York and the life among the urban poor during the late 1800s. Mr. Tate learned that Mr. Riis had a son by the name of John, who was an educator. He persuaded John to move from Richmond, Virginia to start the new school. Mr. Riis was the first person to live in the big house. This is the house where the chimneys used to be. You'll see the two chimneys standing there at the village station. This was nicknamed the Big House. As I mentioned earlier, these are the only things left of the big house that burned in 1959. These chimneys are currently located where the Chimneys building stands in the village station. After Sam Tate died, Steve Tate, his nephew, inherited most of the land that is now Big Canoe. The left photo is a photo of Steve and Lucille Tate in 1931 after they returned from their honeymoon. In the middle is a photo of them in their later years. To the right is a photo of Bill and Dottie Tate. Family members have stated they adored one another. Very few people can say that they have had a town, a road, a business named after them. For this, the Tate family has had the most impact on the history of Big Canoe. This is a very old photo of Lake Sconty during the time when the Tates used it for recreation. Take a look in the background. You see no golf courses. Can you imagine driving around in a speedboat on Lake Sconty? Lake Sconty was much larger when it was built. Cousins reduced the size of the lake to make room for the golf course. It's hard to imagine the POA office at the lodge as a barn. It was once a barn converted by Steve and Lucille in 1951, and they called it Barnwell. Tom Cousins was younger than 40 when he first came up here to Big Canoe. He first started acquiring land in 1965. Tom Cousins, when he came to visit Steve and Lucille Tate to look at the property, he said he was at the lodge and he looked over Lake Sconty and he saw this cabin and he said to himself, "This must be one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen." To the left is Cousins Properties logo, and of course you recognize Big Canoes. They're very similar, aren't they? After Tom Cousins started purchasing land in 1965, in the early 70s, he began to plan, design, and solicit partners to carry out his vision for a second home resort community in the North Georgia mountains. Charles Fraser, also known as Mr. Hilton Head because he developed Hilton Head and Sea Pines, he was the president of Sea Pines Company. He was born in Hinesville, Georgia, and he was about 42 years old when he partnered with Cousins on the Big Canoe project. His expertise lied in second home resorts. His role was to advise, help design the Wolf Scratch Village, and housing to conform to a resort-like community. His company was also in charge of marketing Big Canoe. This part of the presentation will give you some insight of what was taking place during the construction phase of Big Canoe. Lake Pettit, Lake Disharoon, the swim club, Wolf Scratch Village, the tennis courts, the first golf course, the roads and utilities, the tree toppers, and the Sconty Ridge condos were being built all at the same time. There are only a few photos during this period of construction. In late 1973, there was a contest held, and the contest was who could guess when Lake Pettit was going to fill up. And the way that that was judged is when the water started flowing over the spillway. Now remember, the lodge has been a barn, it's been a residence, it has lodged people coming up for visits with Tom Cousins, and now it is a community type center in the 70s as well, and now it's a POA office. Now you get to see Big Canoe completed. There's no specific dates when it was actually completed, but it was from the period of 1973 to 1974. As you can see, there's no Chevron station and there's no IGA store and there's no Big Canoe Realty in this photo. There's the stone columns that are still here. Don't you just love driving through the main gate? Okay, so we didn't have any security gates. What we had was good-looking security guards. This is Anthony Jones, and he informed me that definitely he was packing a 357 Magnum. So the gates were pretty secure back in the day. The main gate was the only gate into Big Canoe in 1973 and 1974. Just about everyone I've interviewed that came up in the early 70s have a story to tell about the Jeeps. At first, the Jeeps were given to folks for free, and then later they were leased to drive around Big Canoe and the Jeep trails. The tree toppers were octagon-shaped homes that were built for weekenders. The two tree toppers seen here were used as a restaurant and a bar. They were connected together by a walkway. These units could be built in 7 to 14 days. By 1975, one of these was converted to a conference room to accommodate a small congregation for a place to worship. The restaurant serves family style, and the cook was Eunice Johnson, who's the grandmother of Tina Parrish. Everyone says that the food was some of the best cooking they've ever had in Big Canoe. This is an ad in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. This is a portion of the ad. What I wanted you to take a look here is look at the general store to your right, and in the back is the chimneys and how everyone's dressed. The whole idea was for people when they came up on the weekends, it would be a place that they got away, and it was nothing like a metropolitan city, and I think they pulled it off pretty well. So many people have indicated to me that this is a special place to them. Everyone enjoyed the general store. If you take a look at it, it's hard to imagine that this is a new building. That's on purpose, as I said before. They wanted these buildings to look like they're 100 years old. The general store sold quilts. Lucille Tate found a lady in Pickens County and they started selling the ladies' quilts. And to the right there is Dottie Tate behind the counter, and these are little girls that used to come up on weekends. My favorite pastime was playing checkers at the general store. This is a picture of the inside of the store, and you have Toad Williams and Floyd Blackwell. Bill Tay was the postmaster at the general store for a while. This facility was located downstairs. The Chimneys restaurant was opened in 1974. Don't you just love the way the server was dressed? Everyone sat together and was served family style. What is family style dining? Family style is where the food is brought out and placed on the table. The food would be passed around as you do at home. This style of dining provided the opportunity for people to socialize and meet other people who came to Big Canoe. In the 1970s, since there wasn't a clubhouse, the lodge was a center point of activities as well as the swim club. The lodge has been a barn, a private residence, a lodge for guests, an activity center, and now is used as the POA offices. Tennis was big in the 70s at Big Canoe. In the background, you see Wolf Scratch School and also a gray inflatable tent. That's where the indoor tennis was played. Okay, notice in the background on Little McElroy Mountain that there's no homes there. And then also there, just past the tennis courts, there's a cabin there. That's no longer in Big Canoe. I don't know what happened to it. I just think it was torn down. The only thing different in this picture is notice that it went from a gray tent to a yellow tent. I'm assuming that probably the yellow tent was not as hot as the gray tent. In 1974, Big Canoe hired Roscoe Tanner, a top player on the pro tennis circuit, as a touring tennis pro. Big Canoe was very proud of their accomplishment. They ran ads announcing Tanner as their touring pro. Tanner beat Borg in one of the matches in 1978, eliminating Borg from the Wimbledon finals. Big Canoe had several celebrity tennis tournaments in the early 70s. And at one of those tournaments, Pepper Rogers, head Georgia Tech football coach, Bobby Riggs, a tennis pro, and Bobby Dodd, Georgia Tech athletic director, played in one of those tournaments. This is the first cart barn that Big Canoe had. It was located on Clubhouse Drive where the villas are today. I assume that this is where the golfers would check in and check out. Ken Williams, a golf marshal with Big Canoe since 1976, says he remembers a few celebrities. One was Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle. He said these two were buddies and they were somewhat intoxicated when they were playing up here. And then you have Leif Trevino. Take a look at these photos and what do you see? You see trees and more trees. There were no houses at the time in 1974 when these photos were taken. The famous slide. So many people have posted on the Facebook group page stating that that was so much fun and they didn't understand why they took it down, but they took it down, I believe, in the 90s for liability purposes. The chapel was actually completed just a few hours before the first service that was performed at the chapel, which was Christmas Eve 1977. You had about 50 people in attendance. The weather was not good, and this was a pretty good attendance when considering the fact that you had about 150 homes in 1977. This is the first Lake Sconty clubhouse built in 1977. It was rather plain, but the people loved it. And I think I've heard some people enjoy it more than the actually current clubhouse that we have. If you look in the background, there's no houses on Little McElroy. Not only did Lake Sconty Clubhouse provide dining and food, it also housed the golf carts. So here's the guys that kept Bicknoo secure in the 70s. In the front is Anthony Jones, and the one leaning up against the truck is Joe Walker, who was the first fire chief. They handled everything. They took care of the security gate, public safety, and they were trained in the fire department as well. Imagine this fire truck going up the mountains. I can't, but maybe you can, but it did. This is the first playground in Big Canoe, and this was before the playfield. In the 70s in the United States, there was a recession. Jimmy Carter was president. Since Big Canoe was marketed as a second home resort, it had a limited market base. In the 70s, wages were low, gas prices were high, and there was not an influx of affluent buyers as we have today. Many second home resorts were already failing before Cousins developed Big Canoe. Financial problems and slow sales were apparent as early as 1974. Sea Pines ended their partnership with Cousins in that year. By the 70s, the banks took over Big Canoe. We were rocking in the 80s. Jane Fonda was teaching us how to exercise. We had cool cell phones so we could walk and talk. Our clothes were bright and stylish. We had it going on, didn't we? Not much was happening in Big Canoe in the 80s or 90s. The banks were in control of Big Canoe, and they were trying to find ways to market and appeal to buyers. In the early 80s, to get things going in Big Canoe, they started marketing timeshares. And this really, as you see in the article, irked a bunch of homeowners. And so there was a lawsuit filed. This is based on an article dated September 27, 1981. Selling the timeshares at Big Canoe did give it a boost. Most of the timeshares were sold at the Pettit Ridge cottages. In one of Bill Burns' interviews, he stated that he was the only investor um, in Big Canoe, and he didn't realize that he was the only person interested in purchasing and buying Big Canoe at that time. Bill Byrne, president of the Byrne Company, acquired Big Canoe in July of 1987. He is responsible for the growth and the expansion of Big Canoe beginning in the early 2000s. Not many changes were made or new construction took place immediately until he could have determined what he had purchased from the banks. He's mostly known for the Wildcat Recreation Center and neighborhood, although he is responsible for building the fitness center in 2001 and numerous other neighborhoods. Only one neighborhood was built after Tom Cousins departed, which was the Lake Watch Villas that were built and sold in the late 70s. Woohoo! We did survive, and so did Big Canoe. So in the 2000s is when things started improving in Big Canoe. Bill Burns started building new neighborhoods, new amenities, and we got a lot of sprucing up. Let's start with an entranceway. So we had the first main gate since 1973, and I believe it wasn't until 2011 that we got this gate, and of course it's changed since then as well. Okay, the chimneys got spruced up as well. It was utilized after the clubhouse was built for meetings and parties that property owners could rent out. And then in the mid 2000s, it was leased to a catering company, and the catering company had it up until just recently. Just to give you a view of what the marina looked like in 1989 and into the 2000s, we have come a long way, haven't we? The Veterans Day tornado or storm was a major event in Bicknell. It happened on Veterans Day, November the 10th, 2002. This is just to give you some images of what the storm damage was, but in the background is the chapel, and this is the play field, and to the right is the tree toppers. This is a view from the top of the dam, and as you can see, a lot of the trees were blown down. I don't know what those buildings are in the background. Um, I don't think that they're still there today. There may be one I think is there, but I'm not sure. One's a utility, and maybe one's used today as a storage for the POA. And looking at the damage, one of the things that I noticed was the amount of trees. And I believe this is where the fire station is to the left on that corner. And then you have the village station general store area was there. So a lot of trees have been cut down, I guess, to make space for parking. The Lake Sconti Clubhouse was struck by lightning in July of 2006. As you can see from the photo, people were looking on from the golf course. This was a tragedy, but it was a blessing in disguise. The clubhouse was marked for a tear down to make way for a new clubhouse. The insurance from the fire helped to defray some of the expenses for the new clubhouse. Okay, so the clubhouse is burned down. So where did people eat? Where did they dine while they were waiting on a new clubhouse to be built? At the swim club, of course. There's not a single individual that has ever talked about the swim club as being the temporary restaurant for Big Canoe. If you have any more details about it, I'd love to hear them. This segment of the presentation is to introduce you to people who have impacted and influenced our great community over the years, and especially the early years. William Bryant McDaniel, known as Bryant McDaniel, was the first general manager in Bicknell. He worked for Tom Cousins and had worked for Tom Cousins for years. He oversaw the construction phase of Big Canoe. He wanted to establish and preserve the vision of Big Canoe. The preserve with wildflower meadows at Big Canoe was dedicated to him, and it was called McDaniel Meadows. Dr. Platt was a pioneer ecologist, teacher, and researcher for over 60 years, coming to Big Canoe in 1978 after his retirement from Emory University. He and his wife Deanie were residents here for 17 years. Dr. Platt was instrumental in setting the course for Big Canoe's natural environment and made a lasting contribution to the community in many ways. He helped establish a strong architectural control committee and served as a member for many years. He named many of the roads in the newly developing Big Canoe. Friendship Force was founded by Reverend Wayne Smith in 1977. This is now an international organization. There's still a chapter in Big Canoe. One of the most memorable things that he accomplished was getting President Carter and Rosalynn to Big Canoe and meet with some of the Soviet dignitaries. They all stayed here in Big Canoe, and this was around the time of 1986. Reverend Broyles was the first chaplain of the Big Canoe Chapel. He was a good friend of Tom Cousins, had known him for years in Atlanta. He began here in 1977 until he retired in 1992. He lived up here during this time. This is a photo of Bobby Otsby. She's the little lady at the bottom corner. This is the only photo I've been able to find of her. She and her husband Tom were the very first permanent residents in Big Canoe. They built their home in 1974. And she had a nickname, Miss Chapel, because she was responsible for help organizing and getting the chapel built and launched. Dick Plummer built 115 Plummer cabins in Big Canoe. He found his way to Big Canoe when Tom Cousins was driving through Lake Lanier. Tom noticed the house that Dick built because it was built without any impact to the environment. The first model homes were built in the Buckskull Hollow neighborhood, and Dick liked to name his homes after trees. Paul Smith was Dick Plummer's superintendent. He started working in Big Canoe in 1976 while commuting from Snellville. He and Patsy bought a lot in 1983 and later built their home on Ridgeview, where they lived for many years. Paul also bought Dick Plummer's company in the 80s and continued to build hundreds of homes in Big Canoe. Paul was also the builder of the Broyles Center, and he was the superintendent of construction for the IGA store. This is a photo of Ken Rice at Eagles Rest on Mount Oglethorpe to celebrate the life of his late wife, Billie Ann. Ken and Billie Ann donated the land, which is now a public park. Ken owned and developed the Waterford neighborhood. After many years of negotiations with Bill Byrne, Waterford was annexed into Big Canoe in 2001. This was a significant event because even though the neighborhood was inside the gates, Ken owned the land and could sell it to anyone to build any type of home. Ken started out working for Tom Cousins in the 70s. The first home that he built was for Dr. Broyles. Ken built hundreds of homes in Big Canoe. Here's a photo of Joe and Louise Dodd, and Louise is Tom Cousins' sister. She's still alive. Joe has passed away. They had a home that was called the Pizza Hut house. I don't know who occupies it now, but I'd love to see it. Thanks to Charlene Terrell, we have this wonderful book. If you haven't read it, Wood Scratch Wilderness, I recommend that you read it. Charlene was instrumental in defining and recording the history of Big Canoe in her book. She was very involved in the chapel and a lot of the activities in Big Canoe, and she also wrote for Smoke Signals. Nancy was a forerunner of the current Trails Committee. She led hikes and introduced many people to hiking. The Nancy Womack Trail was dedicated in her name. The Weaver family suffered tragedy twice. They lost two of their young children. Both are believed to be buried at the center section of the village station. Lucille Tate stopped the bulldozers from leveling the area where the children were buried. The first house built in Big Canoe was built in 1974 by Tom and Bobby Otsby. It's located on Buckskull Ridge Road, and they were the first permanent residents in Big Canoe. While researching Smoke Signals archives, I came across an article and I learned that Big Canoe used to have a member forum. And I was really surprised and I laughed because this was way before the time of Facebook. Of course, they disbanded it and shut down, probably because they really didn't like some of the comments being posted. Toby Jones started working at Big Canoe for a contractor during the construction phase of Big Canoe in 1972. He was 17 years old at the time. Toby became an employee of Big Canoe and retired after 42 years of service. He's standing at one of the moonshine stills in Big Canoe. His mother was the little girl in the photo of the Wood Scratch School picture. Let's see how much you remember. How many cabins were built by the Plumber Company in Big Canoe? Where was the first house in Big Canoe built? What is the oldest public building currently in use? Good luck! Thank you for watching this presentation. It was brief and it wasn't in depth as I would like for it to be, but I was limited on my time. But no worries, there's plenty of history coming soon.